They disowned me on a Sunday. No fight. No explanation. Just a letter slipped under my apartment door with my name typed at the top and the word final stamped across the envelope like some kind of legal execution. I stood in the hallway barefoot, hair still damp from the shower, reading it over and over while the water from my curls traced cold lines down my spine. I'm Amber. I'm 29. And last month, my grandfather left me his entire estate worth over $2 million. The day after the funeral, my mother Patricia demanded I sign it over to her. When I refused, she looked at me like I was a roach crawling across her silk carpet, something inconvenient, something that had to be crushed. My siblings followed suit, each in their own way. Jason stopped returning my texts. Rachel sent one message, a single line, "You've made your choice." Craig, my stepfather, just called me ungrateful. And then silence. Until this morning. This morning, a text arrived, short, pointed, and wrapped in false civility. Family meeting. 3 p.m. Your presence is expected. No please. No context. Just the assumption that I would obey. I almost didn't go. But something in me, pride, curiosity, maybe just that old longing to be acknowledged, got in the car. I drove back to the house I grew up in, the one Grandpa helped pay off after Mom and Craig remortgaged it into a slow death spiral. I walked up the steps, the air stale with summer humidity and old resentment. And when I opened the door, I froze. They were all waiting. My mother, poised like royalty in the armchair Grandpa used to sit in. Jason and Rachel flanking her like foot soldiers. Craig standing off to the side with his arms crossed. And two men in expensive suits, one older, with thinning hair and a smug expression, the other younger, clearly bored. My mother's smile was tight and glossy. She said, "Amber, meet our lawyers." I hadn't been prepared for that. For the paperwork. The legalese. The casual presentation of documents crafted to strip me of everything Grandpa left behind. They came with allegations of coercion, mental decline, undue influence. They'd even pulled old photographs, trying to frame our bond as manipulation. And I sat there, watching my family sell my name like a broken asset. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just said, "Noted." Because what none of them knew, what not even my mother suspected, was that Grandpa had warned me. 2 months before he died, he handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a trust agreement. Quiet, binding, and entirely separate from the will. It named me as sole beneficiary of his private holding company, which included the majority of his business assets, real estate deeds, and a sizable investment portfolio. They'd been fighting over scraps. I already had the entire house. But I didn't tell them that. Not yet. I let them show their teeth. I let them exhaust their cruelty. And then I stood up, smiled just as sweetly, and said, "You'll be hearing from my attorney." The sound of my heels on the hardwood as I left that room was the only noise anyone made. I didn't sleep that night. Not out of fear, I was used to their venom by now, but out of something colder. Something more deliberate. They'd tried to erase me. Now I was going to erase their access to everything they thought was theirs. What they didn't understand was that Grandpa never gave me that money to make me rich. He gave it to protect me from them. I was the only one who listened when he spoke about sacrifice, about building something from nothing, about the weight of responsibility. I sat beside him while he balanced ledgers, while he wrote down the names of every employee he considered family. He used to say, "Money shows who people are when they think no one's watching." And now I had the proof. They weren't watching. They were revealing. So I started watching back. I began collecting things, not items, not jewelry, not assets. Information. Paper trails. Every back-channel conversation they thought I didn't know about. Every bank transfer from the family account. Every time Craig used my grandfather's name to secure a deal. Every time Jason tried to siphon off residuals from the stores under a dormant LLC. I became the ghost in the machine. And when the time came, I didn't storm the gates. I didn't file lawsuits or stage confrontations. I made a single phone call. To the firm Grandpa used when he sold his second hardware chain, a quiet, brutal little operation that specialized in asset protections and strategic corporate dissolutions. We moved quickly. Silently. By the time my mother received notice of the asset freeze, 3 of her credit cards were already declined. Jason's car, leased under the company's name, was repossessed on a Friday afternoon in front of his office. Rachel received a termination letter from the nonprofit she worked at, after the board discovered an undeclared consulting relationship with one of Grandpa's charities. Craig? He never saw the audit coming. None of them did. I watched it unfold from my modest apartment, the same place they'd mocked just weeks before. And I felt nothing. Not triumph. Not vengeance. Just clarity. They hadn't disowned me. They'd freed me. They just didn't know what they'd unleashed in return. And that's when I opened the envelope Grandpa gave me a year before he passed. The one marked in his handwriting, "Use this only when you're ready." Inside was a key. And a deed. To a property I didn't even know he owned. A little house by the water. Quiet. Remote. Untouched. And a note. "I built this for your grandmother. She never got to see it. Maybe now it's yours." I drove there the next morning. And as I unlocked the door to that tiny, beautiful place I never asked for, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I wasn't just going to survive them. I was going to outlive them, in every way that mattered. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old books. There was no electricity when I arrived, just the fading light of dusk and the breathless silence of a place that had waited far too long to be opened. The key stuck a little in the lock. I turned it slowly, unsure what I expected. Dust, maybe. A pile of forgotten boxes. But instead, I found the kind of quiet that feels earned. A stillness that seemed to recognize me. As if this place had always known I would come, even if I hadn't. I set my overnight bag down by the door. No one knew I was here. I had taken back roads, turned off my phone, left my life behind like a skin I no longer needed. Outside, the lake was just beginning to catch the last threads of gold from the sky. I walked through the house with deliberate slowness. The floors creaked beneath me like they were learning me, mapping my weight. Every object felt chosen, sparse, but purposeful. A handmade quilt folded over the arm of a chair. A single ceramic mug beside a sink that hadn't seen water in years. There were no photos. Just a small framed sketch hanging in the hallway, a woman's face turned toward the sea. She looked like no one I recognized. But her eyes felt like mine. I didn't cry. I haven't cried since the funeral. That surprised even me. I loved him. I still do. But grief, in our family, was never allowed to exist without purpose. Grandpa believed in sorrow only when it could teach you something. Otherwise, it was indulgence. And indulgence was something he had no patience for. Instead, I lit a candle I found tucked in a drawer, made tea from the emergency bag of herbs I always carried, and sat by the window. Watching. Remembering. The lake looked endless in the dark. I stayed there long into the night, thinking about the man who built all of this, not just this house, but the scaffolding of my character. The man who taught me the language of ledgers before I learned algebra. Who let me sit beside him during quarterly reviews, tracing the arc of the business with my finger like a child reading a bedtime story. He never said he loved me outright. But I never doubted it. He showed me in silence. In structure. In trust. When I was 10, I remember watching him carry a broken chair out of the hardware store and fix it himself in the alley behind the building. Not because he couldn't afford to replace it, but because waste offended him. He said, "Things deserve a second life. People too." I don't think I understood what that meant until now. My mother never believed in second lives. For her, everything was disposable: marriages, jobs, even children, if we became too inconvenient. Her love had conditions. Mostly obedience. Sometimes performance. I met those conditions when I could. When I couldn't, I vanished from her line of sight. She used to say, "Amber, you're too serious. Too quiet. You need to lighten up or no one will want to be around you." I remember nodding. Smiling. And then going upstairs to read a spreadsheet Grandpa had printed for me, feeling something hollow behind my ribs. I used to think I was the problem, the one who didn't laugh enough, didn't speak up, didn't ask for things the way Rachel did. But now, at 29, I realize I wasn't the problem. I was just inconvenient. And my entire childhood had been a masterclass in emotional triage. At school, I was the girl with neat hair and silent eyes. Teachers liked me. I finished assignments early, read during recess. At home, I became invisible. Useful when needed, quiet when not. I cleaned up after my mother's tantrums and Craig's cigarette ashes. I learned to listen without reacting, to offer help without hope of gratitude. I built myself in secret. Even then, I think Grandpa knew. When I turned 17, he gave me a vintage ledger. Inside, he'd written, "Value is not what people say about you. It's what they can't take from you." I kept that ledger. Still do. It's with me now, on the small table beside the bed in this lakeside house. He never liked sentimentality. But he understood symbols. The week before he died, he asked me what I wanted, not from him, but from life. I told him I didn't know. He said, "That's good. You're not supposed to know yet. But when you do, don't apologize for it." And then he squeezed my hand. Now, sitting in the house he left behind like a final sentence, I think I'm beginning to understand. This wasn't just a gift. It was an invitation. To start something new. To build something clean. To choose myself, not in rebellion, but in intention. But first, I had to go back. Not to them. Not to the estate they thought they could claw back through lawyers and whispers. But to the beginning. To the people he helped. The stores he built. The employees who still wrote letters after his death. I had dozens saved in a file, thank you notes, stories, old invoices with handwriting in the margins that made me smile. He used to say, "A business isn't about money. It's about trust. Money is just the byproduct." That trust, that legacy, was mine now. And I had a responsibility to protect it. Not from outsiders. From blood. The hardest thing in the world isn't letting go of people who hurt you. It's accepting that they never meant to love you in the first place. That their love had no space for your truth. And once you know that, really know it, you stop waiting for an apology that will never come. Instead, you write your own ending. I made a list that night, by candlelight. Names. Accounts. Documents to review. Properties to investigate. A few loyal allies from Grandpa's inner circle who might still be reachable. People who believed in what he stood for, not just what he left behind. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was building a firewall. And if they tried to breach it again, they'd find nothing but silence. Still, I knew my silence wouldn't last forever. Because the moment I cut them off financially, Patricia would lash out. And when she did, I would be ready. What I didn't expect, not then, not even after everything, was the letter I would find under the floorboards 3 days later. Written in Grandpa's hand. Addressed to me. And postmarked 10 years before he died. The envelope was sealed with red wax. It cracked in my hands as I opened it, the imprint of a thumb still faint in the center, his, maybe. I held my breath without meaning to, my fingers trembling in a way they hadn't since the funeral. He had written my name at the top. Just Amber. No date. No greeting. Just the quiet urgency of someone who knew time wouldn't wait. Inside, the handwriting was slower, more deliberate than I remembered. Still neat, but tired. Like a man trying to outrun the future by anchoring himself in words. He wrote, "If you're reading this, something has broken. And I hope it wasn't you." I didn't move for a long time. The house around me blurred into the edge of my vision. I couldn't tell if the ringing in my ears was grief or recognition. He had seen this coming. Not the specifics, maybe, not the lawyers, or the meeting, or the way my mother would try to devour me in front of strangers. But the shape of it. The inevitable hunger of people who mistake proximity for entitlement. He wrote, "The family name may be shared, Amber. But legacy is earned. You know the difference. I hope, by now, you believe me." I did. And for the first time in weeks, I let the truth settle into my body like sleep. He had trusted me with the future. Not because I asked for it. Not because I wanted power. But because I had never looked at him like a wallet. And somehow, he had prepared for all of this before I even understood what was at stake. The rest of the letter was quiet. Personal. He reminded me to keep my shoulders back when walking into a room. To never underestimate the silence of a man who smiles too easily. And to make sure, if I ever married, that I chose someone who didn't flinch at ambition. He ended it with a line I would carry for the rest of my life: "Don't protect the legacy. Become it." I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it beneath the quilted pillow beside me. My tea had gone cold, but I didn't care. I was warmer now, somehow. The next morning, the text came. From my mother. "Since you've decided to isolate yourself, we'll be moving forward without you. There are consequences for turning your back on family." The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh. But I didn't respond. I closed my phone and opened my laptop instead. The trust documents Grandpa had arranged were comprehensive. The holdings were divided across multiple entities, with silent partners listed in states I had never set foot in. It was a fortress of financial complexity, and it was brilliant. But I needed help. Not emotionally. Strategically. There was only one person I could think of who wouldn't flinch at what I was about to do. Her name was Dina Walsh, a probate attorney who'd once handled a property transfer for one of Grandpa's stores. I remembered her because she didn't speak like most lawyers. No posturing. No jargon. Just direct intelligence. I found her number in the estate files, called, and explained everything in plain detail. When I finished, she was silent for a beat. Then she said, "You'll need documentation. All of it. Especially if they've already involved legal counsel." I said, "I've got it." He gave me everything. She replied, "Then this is salvageable." That word, salvageable, stuck in my head. Because this wasn't about recovering something lost. It was about protecting what they never should have touched. Over the next 2 weeks, Dina and I worked quietly. She reviewed the trusts, filed precautionary injunctions, and drafted correspondence that made it clear any interference would be met with immediate legal retaliation. I stayed in the house by the lake, combing through the rest of Grandpa's files. I found old blueprints, dusty ledgers, even letters from vendors thanking him for helping them stay afloat during the recession. Every discovery deepened my understanding of what he'd built, and why he'd left it to me. But with each move I made, the pressure tightened. Rachel emailed me late one night, the tone sickly sweet. "Can we talk? I think we all misunderstood each other." Jason sent a single text. "This isn't how families handle things, Amber. Grow up." And then there was my mother. She left me a voicemail I didn't listen to. Just watched the transcript fill in line by line, like poison through a vein. She said, "You're destroying what's left of this family." For what? Ego? You've always been such a selfish little girl. I closed the app without finishing it. Because the truth was, I wasn't that girl anymore. I had learned to build walls, not to keep people out, but to keep myself intact. Still, there were moments when the loneliness hit hard. At night, especially, when the lake turned black and the wind sounded like voices I didn't want to remember. It's one thing to choose isolation. Another to be exiled by the people whose love once felt like oxygen. I started to doubt myself. Quietly. In the soft hours before dawn, when even the birds held their breath. What if they were right? What if I had become everything they said? Greedy. Cold. Unforgiving. Then, on the third week, I received a letter, handwritten, stamped, no return address. Inside was a single page. It read, "Your grandfather saved my family's business during the 2008 crash. He never asked for repayment. Just told me to pass it on someday. I heard what your mother's doing. Stay strong, Amber." He made the right choice. There was no signature. I pressed the page to my chest. I wasn't alone. I just wasn't surrounded by the people I used to call family. And as I looked out at the lake that morning, something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not grief. Something steadier. I started to believe I could win. But I didn't know yet how far they were willing to go to keep what never belonged to them. And I wasn't prepared for the knock that came the next night, just after midnight. The knock came slow and deliberate. Not frantic. Not uncertain. The kind of knock someone uses when they already know the door will open. I didn't move at first. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, heart thudding against my ribs like it wanted to run without me. Outside, the wind had stilled. No trees rustling. No waves. Just silence pressing hard against the windows, broken only by that sound. 3 sharp knocks. I opened the door. He stood in the porch light with a messenger bag slung across his chest and his coat unbuttoned. Early 30s, maybe. Polished, but not flashy. Too calm for someone visiting a remote house in the middle of the night. He said, "Amber Caldwell?" I nodded. He handed me a business card. His name was Elijah Brandt. A forensic accountant hired by the trust's legal team after Dina flagged a discrepancy in one of the holdings. Apparently, something in the paperwork Grandpa had tucked away didn't match the public filings. He said, "I drove up from the city. I was hoping we could talk now." I stepped aside. We didn't speak again until he sat across from me at the kitchen table. I poured him tea without asking. He accepted it with a quiet thank you and laid out a stack of printed records like a dealer revealing cards in a game I didn't know I was playing. He pointed to a specific entry, a dormant LLC, folded 5 years ago, supposedly liquidated. Except it hadn't been. He said, "This holding owns 4 parcels of land. They were never transferred to your grandfather's estate. But the taxes were paid from one of his accounts." I leaned closer. Each parcel was listed under a trustee name I didn't recognize. A shell. Probably created to mask the transfer. But the bank routing numbers traced back to Grandpa's private account. Elijah continued, "The funds used to pay the taxes were siphoned through a third-party escrow service. It took a while to untangle." I stared at the documents. The properties weren't just land. One was an industrial site. Another, a storage facility, leased and operational. The other 2 were undeveloped but in high-growth zones. Together, they were worth millions. He added, "These aren't just missing assets. They were hidden." I sat back. He watched me carefully, waiting for a reaction I didn't give. Because I already knew. Somewhere deep down, I had suspected there was more. More than what the will stated. More than what the trust held. More than what my family believed they were fighting for. Grandpa had buried things beneath layers so thick it would take someone like Elijah to find them. But he hadn't done it to deceive. He'd done it to protect. I asked, "Can they contest it?" Elijah shook his head. He said, "They'd have to prove intent to defraud. And that's impossible. These were legally purchased, legally maintained, and never named in probate. If anything, it shows he didn't trust the rest of the family." I looked away. That truth still cut, no matter how much I understood it. We spent the next hour going through the rest of the files. Elijah was methodical, professional, but not cold. I appreciated that. He didn't ask personal questions. He didn't push. He just worked. When he finally stood to leave, the sky was beginning to lighten. He said, "There's more I need to trace. But you should know, your mother filed a petition to challenge the trust." I didn't flinch. He continued, "It won't hold. But it will make noise. And she'll use the chaos to her advantage." Of course she would. I walked him to the door. He paused before stepping outside. Then he said, "He trusted you. That's clear in every page I've seen. Don't let them shame you for being chosen." And then he left. I stood in the doorway long after his car disappeared down the gravel road, my fingers cold, my resolve colder. If Patricia wanted noise, she would get it. But she wouldn't find me rattled. She'd find me ready. Over the next week, I stopped reacting and started preparing. Dina filed countermeasures to the petition. She was surgical, calm, and quietly lethal in her approach. For every motion they filed, she dismantled it with precision and patience. Meanwhile, I reached out to the board members of Grandpa's company. I didn't ask for favors. I asked for facts. Most of them had stayed on in advisory roles after his passing. A few had retired. One or two didn't respond. But the ones who did? They told me things I hadn't known. About how Patricia had pushed, years ago, to force a sale of the company to a third-party conglomerate that would have gutted it. About how Grandpa blocked it by transferring voting rights temporarily to a trust. About how she never forgave him for it. They also told me something else. Jason had been quietly trying to buy back into the company through outside investors. Using the family name. Using my grandfather's reputation. Lying about internal support. They were all circling. Not for love. Not even for revenge. Just for control. Because people like my mother don't grieve the man. They grieve the power they lost when he died. I called Elijah again, asked him to run a background check on Rachel's employment. Something about her sudden exit from the nonprofit didn't sit right with me. 2 days later, he sent me an encrypted file. It confirmed what I suspected. Rachel had embezzled nearly $40,000 from the charity. Quietly repaid half after an internal audit flagged irregularities. She left before a formal investigation could begin. No charges were filed. But the timing? It lined up perfectly with Grandpa's final hospitalization. He knew. And he still gave her nothing. The same day that file came in, Dina forwarded a new motion from Patricia's lawyers. They were requesting a deposition. Of me. Not to ask about the trust. But about Grandpa's mental capacity. They were trying to prove he was unfit when he signed the final documents. It was a desperate move. But not a stupid one. If they could chip away at credibility, mine, his, they might get traction. And they were counting on one thing. That I would crack under the weight of my own silence. But they didn't understand something fundamental. Silence isn't absence. It's a choice. And when it's chosen, it becomes armor. So I agreed to the deposition. And I started assembling everything I'd need for that room. Not just documents. Not just financials. Stories. Witnesses. People who knew what he stood for. People who saw what he built. The ones who matter don't forget. And the ones who forget? They never mattered. Still, a part of me wondered, as I filed another affidavit, as I reviewed another line item, what it would cost to win. Because victories like this don't come clean. They come with blood on the edges. And as I stood at the window that evening, watching the lake ripple under a sky full of warning, I realized the deposition wouldn't be the final blow. Something bigger was coming. And I had no idea which side of me it would demand. It wasn't the confrontation I feared, it was who I might become in the middle of it. Because I knew that once I crossed that line, there would be no retreat. Not for them and not for me. The deposition was set for a Friday. Neutral location, private conference room in a downtown law office. Dina warned me ahead of time, the opposing counsel would push. They wouldn't go for facts. They'd go for fault lines. Emotional ones. Personal ones. Anything they could exploit to fracture me in front of a stenographer and a camera. I wore navy. Not black, too severe. Not gray, too forgettable. Navy was clarity without sharpness. I pulled my hair back, kept my jewelry minimal. No perfume. No expression. They were already seated when I entered. Patricia at the head of the table, posture straight and chin high, as if she were attending a charity gala. Jason on her left, scrolling through his phone. Rachel on the right, eyes flickering with something between contempt and fatigue. Craig wasn't there. I didn't ask why. I nodded to Dina, who gave me the faintest nod in return. She was a wall beside me. A sharp, silent force in a soft blouse and unshakable confidence. Their lawyer was a man named Doyle. Mid-50s. Handsome in the way men get when they learn to weaponize charm. He greeted me politely, performed the whole civility act. But I saw the calculation in his eyes. He was here to crack something open. The deposition began. He asked questions like someone peeling an onion. Slowly, layer by layer, letting the sting build as he worked inward. Would you say your grandfather's cognitive health declined in the final year? Did he ever confuse you for someone else? Do you believe a man that should have made such significant estate decisions? I answered with steady tone and measured words. No emotion. No hesitation. Dina objected where appropriate, but let me handle the rest. We had discussed this. If I showed weakness, it would be spun as guilt. If I showed anger, it would be spun as manipulation. So I showed nothing but truth. Then he changed tactics. He said, Miss Caldwell, how would you describe your relationship with your mother? The pause that followed was long enough for Rachel to shift in her chair. I replied, limited. As of late, non-existent. He said, would you say you harbor resentment toward her? I looked at Patricia, whose mouth twitched slightly. I said, I've moved beyond resentment. I've moved beyond expectation. He said, so you felt entitled to the inheritance because of emotional distance? I said, I felt entitled to nothing. I was named, not by chance, by design. The room cooled after that. Doyle asked a few more questions, but the momentum had shifted. He had tested my armor and found no cracks. Then he made his final move. He turned to Rachel. He said, would you mind stepping forward for a supplemental statement? Dina tensed beside me. We hadn't been told anyone else would testify. Rachel stood slowly, walked to the table, adjusted the chair with theatrical care. She looked at me once, just once, before lowering her gaze to her hands. She said, our grandfather was unwell. We all saw it. He couldn't even remember the name of his housekeeper some days. He relied heavily on Amber. Almost exclusively. She filtered what he saw. Who he spoke to. It created a bias. Dina interrupted, we'll object to any speculative statements not grounded in evidence. Doyle held up a hand. Let her finish. Rachel continued. She said, I'm not saying Amber coerced him. I'm just saying, the version of her you all see now isn't the version we grew up with. She always had something to prove. Always wanted to be seen as the golden one. Maybe she didn't manipulate him intentionally. Maybe she just couldn't help herself. There it was. The narrative. Amber the desperate. Amber the overlooked. Amber the emotionally hungry. I didn't respond. Not then. Not even when Doyle asked if I'd like to clarify. I just looked at Rachel. And smiled. Softly. Slowly. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the morning before the deposition, Elijah had sent me something. An audio recording. One of Grandpa's last dictated letters, stored in a voice app he used when his hands grew too tired to write. In it, he said, "If they ever question it, tell them I wasn't confused. Tell them I chose the only one who ever sat in silence and listened." I hadn't shared it yet. But I would. Not for revenge. For record. The deposition ended. Dina and I walked out in silence, down the elevator, into the cold air that bit my cheeks like small, precise knives. In the car, she said, "They're more desperate than I thought." I said, "They should be." We didn't talk after that. There was nothing left to say. The rest would unfold on paper, in courtrooms, in financial consequences they couldn't outrun. But I knew Patricia. She wouldn't wait for the legal system. She would retaliate another way. I just didn't expect it would come through the one channel I hadn't fully fortified. That evening, I logged into one of Grandpa's old business accounts, the one still active for vendor communication. The password didn't work. I tried again. Locked. I went into the administrative portal. And that's when I saw it. Someone had attempted to override access. 5 hours ago. And the request? Had come from my mother's IP address. Some betrayals don't come with blood or shouting. Some arrive quietly, hidden in a digital signature, cloaked as routine access. But when it's your mother trying to break into the lifework of the man who trusted you to protect it, you feel it like a blade through the ribcage. I stared at the screen, the error message blinking with sterile finality. 5 failed login attempts. 1 successful override attempt. IP address traced. Patricia's name registered as the requesting party. She didn't even bother to hide it. I forwarded everything to Dina and Elijah, attached screenshots, and flagged it as urgent. Within minutes, my phone lit up. Dina's voice was clipped and low. She said, "This crosses into criminal territory." I said, "She's panicking." She replied, "And reckless. That makes her dangerous." The next day, Dina filed an injunction and emergency restraining order to prevent further interference with any financial or corporate systems connected to the estate. We submitted the server logs. Timestamped access attempts. Internal admin flags. It was airtight. Still, I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid of losing. Because I had seen her desperation. The kind that burns through logic, through legacy, through blood. She was willing to torch what she didn't control. And people like that don't stop when you say no. They stop when there's nothing left to steal. The media caught wind by the end of the week. A leaked court filing, perhaps intentional, perhaps not. Small-town news first. Prominent family dispute heats up over multi-million-dollar inheritance. My name was in the second paragraph. Patricia's in the headline. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. But I watched. I watched the way the board of Grandpa's company went silent. Meetings postponed. Emails unreturned. Neutrality wrapped in politeness. I watched Jason's social media go private. Watched Rachel delete 2 years of curated posts. Watched Craig vanish from LinkedIn entirely. They were retreating. Not out of shame. Out of strategy. Because when power slips through your hands, image becomes currency. And if they couldn't win in court, they'd try to bleed me elsewhere. So I leaned in. I authorized Elijah to run full financial audits on all known accounts linked to Patricia and her 2 children. I requested records from the charitable foundations Grandpa supported, asking quietly if any family members had tried to position themselves as successors or liaisons. And I started visiting the stores. Quietly. Unannounced. I walked the aisles. Talked to the managers. Listened. One woman, 60, soft-spoken, told me she'd worked there since the first year it opened. Grandpa gave her a $1,000 bonus during the recession because she lost her husband and still showed up every day. She said, "He used to say, if it's not human first, it's not worth building." I thanked her and stood in the parking lot afterward with the wind pulling at my coat. That was why he chose me. Because I remembered. Because I was never trying to become him. I was trying to preserve what made him real. The deposition hadn't broken me. The system hack hadn't scared me. But this, the legacy left in the voices of strangers, this anchored me. When I returned to the lake house, a package was waiting. No name. No return address. Just a plain manila envelope. Inside were printed screenshots. Pages from my college years, an old anonymous blog I'd written under a pseudonym, about being invisible in your own home. About watching your mother rearrange her face for strangers and melt it into something cruel when the door closed. The email it had been sent from was traceable. Elijah confirmed it by morning. Jason. An attempt to smear me. Paint me as a bitter daughter seeking vengeance. Possibly to discredit me before a judge, or worse, to poison future business relationships. I said nothing publicly. But I documented everything. Dina and I met with the judge 2 days later. Private chambers, as part of the emergency filing. She laid out the pattern: emotional coercion, property interference, defamation attempts. The judge didn't speak for a long time afterward. Just sat there, tapping his fingers against the edge of the desk. Then he said, "These people don't want an estate. They want a weapon." The injunction was granted in full. Not just for the trust. For me. A legal barrier now stood between me and my mother, Jason, Rachel. Any breach would lead to criminal charges. Any public statements would be met with defamation suits. They had pushed. I had pushed back. But now there was nowhere left for them to go. I expected silence. But silence, as it turned out, was never Patricia's weapon of choice. The call came at 2:17 a.m. I let it ring 4 times before answering. I knew who it was. She didn't even wait for my greeting. She said, "I hope you know how deeply you've embarrassed this family." I said, "You stopped being my family the moment you tried to erase him." She laughed, not kindly. Then she said, "You think he loved you more? That he left you the future because you earned it?" "No, Amber. He left it to you because he knew no one else would want to carry it. You were the only one naive enough to think legacy is a gift." I didn't reply. Because I knew something she didn't. Legacy wasn't a gift. It was a responsibility. A quiet, grueling, and often lonely one. She ended the call by saying, "We'll see how long you last with nothing but paper and pride." And in that moment, I felt no rage. No pain. Only relief. Because I finally heard her clearly, not just the words, but the truth in them. She had never wanted him. Just what he owned. And now that I had it, she'd never stop hating me for existing in the space she thought belonged to her. So I put the phone down. Walked to the window. And opened it to let in the cold night air. Because something in me had just closed. And something else had just begun. I didn't know it yet, but I would receive one final envelope the next day. Not from a lawyer. Not from a court. From someone I had never expected to hear from again. Forgiveness doesn't come in envelopes. But closure sometimes does. It arrived in a pale blue package, thick paper, the kind used for wedding invitations or birth announcements. No return address. My name handwritten in black ink, not my full name, just Amber. Like a whisper only one person still had the right to use. Inside was a letter. And a photograph. The photo stopped me cold. It was of me, maybe 15 years old, sitting on the back steps of Grandpa's hardware store with oil on my jeans and a ledger in my lap. He was beside me, holding a thermos, mid-laugh. The sunlight had caught his face at just the right angle. His eyes weren't focused on the camera. They were watching me. On the back, written in pen, when she still believed in good endings. The letter was from Barbara, Grandpa's sister. I'd met her once, decades ago, at a family reunion I barely remembered. She lived in Oregon, had fallen out with Patricia long before I was born. She was distant, but not estranged, at least not from him. She wrote, "I heard what's happening. I stayed quiet because I thought you had enough voices in your head. But I need you to know something." The letter wasn't long. She told me about the year Grandpa almost lost everything. Long before I was born. How he'd taken a loan from a predatory lender to save one of his first stores. How Patricia, then barely 20, had tried to convince him to let it fold and cash out the assets. "You can start fresh," she'd told him. "You don't owe anyone anything." But he had refused. He'd worked 3 jobs. Slept in the back office. Rebuilt the business brick by brick. And when he finally paid the debt, he took the loan agreement, framed it, and hung it behind his desk. I remembered that frame. I just never knew what it held. Barbara ended the letter with this: "She didn't understand what he built. But you do. That's why he chose you. Not out of guilt. Out of recognition." I set the letter down and let the weight of it move through me. Not pride. Not vindication. Something quieter. Affirmation. The days that followed were still. The legal proceedings unraveled exactly as Dina predicted. The court dismissed Patricia's petition as meritless. The injunctions were upheld. The remaining trust assets were secured. Elijah submitted his final audit report, clean, comprehensive, damning in its quiet exposure of what they had tried to take. But I didn't celebrate. I signed documents. Replied to emails. Scheduled meetings with the new advisory board I had formed for the business holdings. And then I did something unexpected. I took 3 days off. I drove north, past towns with names I didn't recognize, until the air changed and the trees thinned and I could see stars again. I stayed in a cabin with no reception. I walked until my feet hurt. I read the letter again. I looked at the photo until the edges curled. And I let myself feel the things I had pushed down for months, not grief, exactly, and not rage. Just the ache of survival. Because that's what this had been. Not a battle for money. Or control. A battle for identity. And now that it was over, I felt something like hunger. Not for vengeance. Not for restitution. For restoration. When I returned to the lake house, the air was warmer. Spring was stretching its fingers through the trees, brushing the water with green light. I stood in the living room, looking at the space Grandpa had meant for someone else, for a love he lost, for a life that never happened. And I made a decision. I wouldn't sell it. I would renovate it. Carefully. Respectfully. I'd open it to women who needed silence. Who had been disowned, dismissed, broken by the ones meant to protect them. A retreat of sorts. Quiet healing. Nothing loud. Just a space to breathe. I told no one at first. But I started sketching plans. Gathering names. Slowly, gently, I began shaping a second life from the ashes of the first. Dina called a week later with final closure on the legal case. She said, "It's done." I said, "No. It's just beginning." I meant it. Because the work wasn't in the courtrooms. It was in the rebuilding. I hired a small team to help with the estate. No one flashy. Just people who understood quiet efficiency. The kind Grandpa valued. I visited the stores again. Sat down with longtime staff. Asked questions. Listened to answers. I started attending community events he used to support. Not to make a show, just to watch, to understand. To be present. Patricia never reached out again. Neither did Jason. Rachel sent one final email, one line: "I didn't know it would go this far." I didn't respond. Because it had always been this far. They just hadn't seen the depth of it until the bottom gave out. I changed my last name 6 months later. Not out of shame. Out of sovereignty. Amber Caldwell became Amber Lorne, a nod to my grandmother's maiden name, the one Grandpa used to say carried all the strength the family ever needed. I stood before a judge, signed the papers, and walked out into the sunlight with no fanfare. And in that moment, I felt light. Not happy. Not triumphant. Just aligned. Years from now, they'll forget why they hated me. They'll rewrite the story in their minds, turn themselves into victims, heroes, whichever suits the moment. But I'll remember. Not the betrayals. Not the courtroom tension. Not the letters or the noise. I'll remember the sound of my grandfather's laugh in that photograph. The quiet steadiness of his trust. And the way this house, this life, held steady beneath the weight of my silence. Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about what you carry forward without apology. And I'm carrying it now, fully, freely, finally, in my own name.